Now, one term that's going to recur as we talk about movement, and which is very important if we wish to understand what the brain's role in all this is the notion of control. As I said in the first video, we need to resist the temptation to simplistically assume the brain controls the body. That turns out to be a very problematic way of looking at the brain. If you think about it, it's full of fanciful background ideas about the autonomy of the person, as if you were independent of everything else, as if you were complete, controlled, whole in a certain way. It suited man's vision of man in previous centuries, but it's fanciful. And after the Second World War, the notion of control emerged as a topic that could be discussed in an interdisciplinary fashion. That is, people from all different disciplines, from anthropology, engineering, psychiatry, mathematics, they all had different views of what control means. This became a central theme in the emerging field of cybernetics, which gave us computer science and artificial intelligence and robotics and so many other things. So this notion has been thoroughly explored in rather a profound sense in the last 70 years. But of course, in everyday usage, we use it in a very simple fashion. So when we say, let's try to be aware of what we're trying to prevent ourselves from thinking. This is what is not going on in locomotion. You may have heard stories like this in school, but it's nonsense. The brain doesn't, you might say the brain decides where the foot will go next, and it figures out what muscle combination will get there, and then it commands those muscles to move that much, and then it decides on the next footfall and so on. So there's those kind of verbs that we need to avoid using with brains. They don't decide, figure out, or command. Brains do not do that thing. And so we need an alternative vocabulary if we're going to understand how the body moves. And in second place, what the brain's role is here. So a good place to start is with the notion of a puppet. We said that a simplistic notion of control assigns the role of a puppeteer to the brain and the role of an inert puppet to the body. So here's a real puppet. And you can see the puppeteer there, and there are 4 strings. So in order to make this puppet dance, the puppeteer has to yank 4 different strings. Now that's quite complicated. Puppeteers only have 2 hands. So you'd really need 4 hands to control this. So what they've done is they've built a little wooden thing to simplify the arrangements. Now those 4 strings are not entirely independent of each other, and the job of the puppeteer becomes easier. In technical language, we say that the number of degrees of freedom of this puppet went from 4 to a number less than 4. Degrees of freedom is simply the separate strings you can yank. Okay, the things that can be independently controlled. And thinking about degrees of freedom is very important if we wish to get a handle on the question of movement. So, as the puppeteer notion of control encourages us then to ask, how many strings would the puppet of the body have? How many things are there that can be individually controlled? Because each thing that can be individually controlled is 1 degree of freedom. And we saw with the puppet, well, controlling a puppet is hard with 4 degrees of freedom. How many would be involved in moving the human body? How many strings would the puppeteer have? Well, here's a little thought exercise. This character is a Japanese Enso character. And there's a kind of a spiritual calligraphic Zen art in Japan in which you paint one of these in a single stroke. I'll illustrate that here. So you paint it in a single stroke. Now we know, as it were, one thing about the movement that produced this. There it goes again. You can stop. Is that the final trace of the hand is very simple, is a circle. But in order to do that, you need to move your hand, your fingers, your wrist, your elbow, your arms, and your trunk, at least, assuming you're sitting down. If you're standing up, there'll also be legs involved. So in that one single circular movement, all these different pieces need to collaborate and cooperate together towards the circular end goal, as it were. Now, when I mention wrists, elbows, shoulders, I'm talking about joints. And we could consider this in terms of joint movement. We will in just a minute. But each joint is itself another problem because each joint is, as it were, controlled or moved by many muscles. And then we can dig down into the muscle, and what we'll see is that each muscle contains numerous parts that are independently movable. Those are muscle packets. And then we explore the muscle packet and we find individual nerve fibers, each of which is relatively independent of the other. So at each stage in our exploration, the numbers of degrees of freedom exploded. The circle is a very simple goal. The joints involved, we might simplify and say, well, there's 1 degree of freedom in the elbow joint because it just moves up and down. The wrist is horrendously complicated, but we could say it's approximately 3 degrees of freedom, and the same for the shoulder, about 3 degrees of freedom, so giving us 7 different strings if the joints were all that needed to be steered by the puppeteer. But of course, each joint has multiple muscles, each muscle has multiple packages, and on it goes. You end up with the number of degrees of freedom of even a simple movement like drawing that circle as being in the many, many, many millions, if not billions. That's not the way puppets work. And this was recognized at the start of the 20th century in Soviet Russia. A colleague of Lev Vygotsky, another one of these geniuses who emerged after the founding of the Soviet Union, was Nikolai Bernstein. And what he observed was that when we see bodies moving, they act in a coordinated fashion. They don't act as if they were cobbled together and trying to hold all these different pieces together. Because if you've got multiple things which are being independently controlled, getting a smooth coordination out of the whole is very difficult. But when we look at movement in animals, this is coordinated. This is smooth, controlled, reactive, appropriate, elegant, but above all, it doesn't look like bits cobbled together. It looks like it's all of one kind. It's coordinated and not controlled. Even a millipede who has very little brain, indeed, manages to move all its legs in a fashion appropriate to its particular form of life, with almost no control, but coordination emerges here now, from our point of view, as the better way to think about this. And the study of animal movement goes back a long way, but it made significant advances in the 19th century, in part through the work of this guy, Edward Muybridge. He was a very colourful character, and in the resources for this week's topic, you'll find a film about his life. A very, very interesting man. But you may know some of his images from the web where they've been passed around. But back in the 1870s, he built a big photographic studio in California. Taking one photograph at that time was very difficult. You had to load a big sheet into the camera. Then you had to expose the sheet and then close it again and then cover things up and take it out and develop it. It's a lot of work for one photograph. So getting 2 photographs in a row was already difficult, and he set up a studio with a whole bank of cameras, each of them fired by tripwires, so that he would get animals and humans to move from one camera to the other, setting off these tripwires and producing these kinds of images. You may have seen them. He produced a huge volume of movement, locomotion in animals and humans, which is gorgeous. This is probably the most famous of those. You've probably seen it on the web. And rumor has it, I don't know if it's true, that this was actually inspired in part by the desire to settle a bet which happened in a pub some night. And the question at issue was whether a galloping horse ever has 4 feet off the ground at the same time. That's not the kind of question that we're going to get into a barroom fight over, because we're very familiar with photographs. But in the 1870s, when people were not so familiar with photographs, this was a genuine question. It's an easy one to decide if you have a photograph. And Muybridge settled the matter quite conclusively. You can see in the third picture in the top row, the horse definitely, during the gallop, has 4 feet off the ground. It's a good man, Edward Muybridge, kicking off a century or more of the study of animal locomotion. So from what we've seen, while we think in simplistic terms that behaviors arise from controllers, coordinated movement that we see in actual animals suggests otherwise. So importing a simplistic notion of control into our scientific account of movement is going to be very difficult. So we're going to have to just abandon this idea of the brain as being some kind of puppeteer and see what other ways we can get of understanding control. Here's a little video clip of a roboticist, Rob Pfeiffer, who will illustrate 3 robots, each of which is controlled, that is driven by the same system, but which display radically different behaviors.
Now, I'm going to show you a few behaviors, and whenever you observe a particular behavior, the question arises as to what the underlying mechanisms are that bring this behavior about. So now here's one that I like very much. We call him Crazy Bird. There's another one. So the question is now, what are the mechanisms, or what is the control that's actually underlying the behavior of these creatures? Now, it turns out that, and of course we know because we built the systems. This is the control. So it's basically just the wheels turning at a constant speed. Okay, now if you remember Crazy Bird, it was doing all sorts of things, but the control is just this. And by the way, the control for all of these 3 creatures is exactly the same, but they do very different things. So the diversity in the behavior of Crazy Bird cannot possibly be due to the diversity of the control, because the control is, I mean, you can hardly call this control. It's just these wheels turning at a constant speed.
So we've seen that in elucidating the notion of control, we've moved towards an alternative notion, which is coordination, which seems to be more appropriate to describing how animals, at least, and probably humans, also move. In fact, human movement is not really different from animal movement, is it? So we'll go on now, and in the next video we'll explore how we might begin to study coordination.